Welcome for people that are with us. We're going to wait another minute or two, and then we'll get started. All right, let's get started. So welcome, everyone. It's great to have you with us for this conversation on the psychology of mental health and performance. Over the past years, we've heard more and more from many of you and other business leaders about the commitment and challenges that you have in this area and how to lead this in organizations while also having greater and greater performance. And at the same time, the costs of not putting so much attention on this continue to increase. Lorenzo, are you able to go to the next slide?
Sure.
Thanks. So those costs in terms of poor mental health, 56 billion in the UK in 2020, 2021, and then across the US workforce, that missed work is estimated at about 47 billion annually in lost productivity. So the costs are continuing to go up, and as leaders, many of us are not educated in psychology, and many have told us about the challenges they face in leading in this area of mental health, psychological safety, and performance. So we created this three-part webinar that has the first now, and then second in June, and third in October, where we'll continue to go into greater detail, engaging with the latest research, expanding our own understanding, and leaving with thinking and approaches to bring to our leadership and support our people. The other thing about these stats is that the current data is coming out in the next few months and is estimated to be 20% higher than these numbers. So our colleague Lorenzo is going to walk us through this presentation today. Lorenzo Gallinari is one of JMJ's subject matter experts on this topic. He's a clinical and organizational psychologist. He's consulted globally over 20 years in areas of safety leadership, performance, mental health, and psychological safety, and speaks at conferences and events as an expert on this subject. Lastly, in terms of logistics, we all have cameras off as set in the system so that we can focus on the presentation. If you have any questions while Lorenzo's presenting, you can include them into the group chat, or if you prefer, you can send them to me privately. I'll collect them, I'll select a few, and in about the last 10 to 12 minutes, we'll have an opportunity for some Q&A based on some of those questions that you ask. And looking forward to doing that with you. You'll receive the PDF file of the presentation afterwards and a link to the recording. There we are. Thanks for being with us, and Lorenzo, over to you.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Michael. Thank you for this introduction and creating a little bit of the context of the conversation today. As you mentioned, this is part one of 3 appointments that we have designed and organized. And today we're going to mainly focus on truly understanding the topic that we will be speaking about. So obviously the focus is these 2 domains that we usually keep separate, which is the one of mental health and psychological well-being, and then the one of performance. And what happens if you actually bring these 2 domains together, okay, from a psychological perspective. So from a psychological perspective, it means we're going to look into how does our brain and how does our mind deal with its own health, and how does our brain and our mind deal with this notion of performance. And today, session number 1, we're going to have primarily a focus on the individual aspect of it. A lot of the people on this webinar are leaders of teams and leaders of people. So you probably have a lot of questions about how do I take care of the mental health and psychological well-being and performance of the teams that I manage, okay? Please be a little bit patient when it comes to that, because today, session number 1, we're going to focus a little bit more on the individual aspects of mental health and performance and psychological safety. As we progress throughout the sessions, we're going to bring more and more a focus onto the environment and therefore the team dynamics when it comes to these subjects, as you can see here from at the bottom of this slide. Session number 2, we're going to dive into the notion of learning. How do we learn as human beings? And why do we look at that? It's because fundamentally for human beings to perform is to learn, meaning to learn to do things better, to learn to do things differently, to adapt to the different challenges that we face in life. So learning is a fundamental cognitive capability of ours that we need to understand how it works. And then session number 3, as it says there, it's mainly going to be about how do I facilitate the creation of an environment where people can truly perform at their best of their capabilities when possible. Okay, so this is the little journey that we're going to try to take together, and going into medias res, as the Romans used to say, which means straight into the heart of the matter. Why did we put these two topics together, mental health and performance? Is because if you quickly look throughout the history of our species, history of human beings, you can see that nowadays we're dealing with an environment which is way more complex than ever in our history. Obviously, we went from here, which is, it's a little cartoon, but it depicts the notion of going from a lifestyle which was very dangerous, where survival was a constant threat, and therefore our cognitive and mental representation were all designed into how do we deal with such an environment. Now skip a few thousand years later and you end up in an environment which is the one of today's world, which is fundamentally performance oriented. What I mean by that is that since the moment in which you and I are born, more or less, especially starting with the school years, and then for the rest of our lives, up until, for most of us, retirement age, and a little bit even later, you and I live inside of a world of performance. You go to school, you're measured on how quick, how well, how deeply you learn, and how accurately can you repeat what you have learned to the teacher, into the test, and so forth and so on. Then you go to any kind of job, and nowadays your way of working is measured. We measure performance everywhere in the environment in which you and I exist. So you can imagine that to operate in this very volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environment that puts performance at the heart of its own essence, develops brains and capabilities which are different from what was requested thousands of years ago. Now, with these new capabilities, with these new abilities also come different kind of mental health issues. And that's one of the reasons why this topic is becoming more and more interesting nowadays to people, and especially to leaders of organizations. Interesting enough, there's almost 1 billion people per year that suffer from these two disorders that you can see here, depression and anxiety disorders. Depression is fundamentally an outlook of life where you can't truly get beyond a very sad mood. And anxiety is when you look into your future, short-term, long-term, and you're overwhelmed by a sense of being inadequate to deal with the challenges of your life, and therefore you experience anxiety. Now, these two disorders are increasing in their amounts in today's world compared to the past, at least since we're keeping track and record of these statistics. Now, what is interesting is that these two mental disorders are mostly originated by the way in which we deal with the environment. These are not something that you inherit most of the time. This is something that happens to you in life by virtue of the environment inside of which you grow up, or by virtue of the environment in which you find yourself to be, which is very interesting when you look at this second graph here on the right, because for both these disorders, you can see that they peak in terms of frequency during people's most active years of work. Okay, so you can draw your own conclusions, but definitely there is some interesting correlation between the amount of time that people spend at work during certain period of their lives and these mental disorders. One last piece of data, not to bore you too much with graphs and stats, but one thing which is important for all of us to know, especially if you're a leader of people and organizations, is that generally, a little bit everywhere in the world, there still is a big stigma when it comes to speaking about mental issues. People don't talk about them openly. So if you have people in your teams that are going through some moments, periods of depression, stress, anxiety, chronic stress, so forth and so on, very rarely they would put their hand up and share their problems openly, especially in a work environment. You can see here that in upper middle income countries or high income countries, still 64%, 80% of anxiety disorders, they go untreated, not even diagnosed most of the time. People don't talk about them. If we have a problem into our, I don't know, right knee or right foot, we would immediately, or kidney, we would immediately go to the doctor because that seems to be a big impediment to our daily life. But when we deal with mental disorder, people tend to take them with a different approach, thinking that they will go away or thinking that they are not important. Again, something critical for leaders to understand about how people operate. I know I'm moving very quickly, okay? Please indulge me. We have quite an amount of material to cover. So next, a couple of interesting, quote, false myth around performance. And I don't speak about performance in general here. I'm speaking from a psychological perspective. And it's useful to create some clarity around a few ideas which might not be very helpful from a psychological perspective. First one, the ones in bolds are the one that I'd like you to focus on more. Competitive environments motivate people to improve. That is a big belief that we usually have, but actually it's not true. Human beings, they perform much better in collaborative environment. The science behind this is now fully recognized, and competition is great in the very short term, and in some performance sports, especially individual ones. But when it comes to longer productivity, longer performance, human beings, they work much better in a climate of collaboration. Number 4 is also interesting here, which says the more you work, the more you achieve. That is also not true. Okay, my productivity, your productivity fluctuates during the day, during the week, during the month, depending on the brain energy cycles. So for example, if you begin to work, you are very productive for a certain amount of time, usually half an hour. You peak after half an hour, and then your productivity, your capacity, the capacity of your brain to elaborate information tends to go down. Okay, and then therefore you need to take a break for 5-10 minutes, and then you can work again. So to work long hours with one meeting after the next, really not good for productivity, apart from not being good for health. Constant challenges and pressure help me to perform better. That is also not true, because to experience relentless pressure to produce results leads you to emotional and mental burnout. Okay, to keep people under the pressure for result gives the leaders a sense of control, an illusion of control, but doesn't make people to perform better. Number 7, we should avoid focusing on mistake, and we should focus on the positive. It's better for learning. That's a little bit in the fashion, in the geist of today's spirit, that you shouldn't focus on mistakes, focus on what's positive. Unfortunately, our brains are not designed for that. Okay, our brains are designed to learn from mistakes. We learn from what doesn't work. You don't pay attention to your washing machine as long as it works. Okay, you realize how it works, the washing machine, when it breaks down. Okay, so the question truly here is, how do we make the environment psychologically safe so we can learn from our mistakes? Beg your pardon for the example on the washing machine, but it's the one that came to my mind now. A few, again, urban legends around mental health. First one is, as we said, it's just mental health. Don't bother, it'll go away. It's not a big deal. Well, what happens inside of your brain is the most important stuff that happens in our lives in general, because it influences every single part of our life. People sometimes think that stress is not a big deal. Don't worry about it, it'll go away. Stress, chronic stress, is the #1 cause for heart diseases. Heart disease, #1 cause for fatalities, for killing people. Actually, #2, malaria, mosquito is the #1. But in terms of illnesses, heart diseases, most of which are caused by stress. A mental health condition is a sign of weakness, number 5. That is not true. Okay, it's a sign of probably not having a lifestyle or mental habits which support a certain amount of psychological well-being. Number 7, you only need to take care of your mental health if you have a mental health condition. That, again, not really true. The health of our mental condition is something to be taken care of on a daily basis. It depends a lot of building the right mental habits. Like you and I have eating habits, we have sleeping habits. Mental habits are the same, something to be built, something to be structured inside of our daily routine, and something that we will talk about much more on session number 2. Okay, so just a couple of interesting points to clarify for everybody here. And then I'd like to draw your attention to this slide, which probably is the most important one in the series here, which creates a distinction between 3 ideas, which are obviously correlated. And the first one is mental health. I'd like to draw your attention to mental health first. And what is mental health? Mental health is a condition, like your physical health. You go to the doctor, it tells you you're in good health or not in good health. Well, the same thing is for mental health, okay? Obviously, you're on a spectrum. You can have a big disorder or be mentally absolutely fine or anywhere in between. Mental health is a condition. And when you are in good mental health, it means that you can cope with the different challenges that life is throwing at you using your abilities and realizing what psychologists call your potential. So that's mental health. It's a condition. It's a state in which you find your mind to be. Second concept is psychological well-being. Psychological well-being is an experience that you have of your own emotional inner state. How do I feel about today? How do I feel about myself today? It's about how do I experience my inner world? Do I feel content? Do I feel satisfied? Do I feel joyful? Etc., etc. Okay, so mental health is a condition. Psychological well-being is an experience that I have about myself. Number 3, psychological safety. Now, psychological safety describes a belief that I have, not about myself, but about the environment inside of which I am. Now, that's important to distinguish. So psychological safety is a belief that I have about the kind of environment in which I find myself to be. And it's a kind of environment that allows for me to be myself. I don't have to worry if I make a mistake. I don't feel threatened by other people. I don't feel that if I express my opinion, there will be negative consequences, etc., etc. Now, interesting is this lower part of the slide. As an organizational leader or as a manager or as someone that helps people to perform at work, you can do something about their mental health, but people's mental health is a product of so many variables, most of which are also outside of work. Children's health, spouses, financial conditions, my own physical health, things that are not relating to work. Therefore, you as a manager or as a leader can't truly impact that directly more than a little. Second one, psychological well-being. Can you make, as a leader, people feel good about themselves, feel good about their lives? A little bit, okay? But again, quite limited as an impact. Where you can exercise most influence is on psychological safety. That's where it becomes an interesting game to play, because psychological safety is the creation of an environment where people feel safe. That, as a leader, is something that you can shape. Oftentimes we speak about, an organizational culture. Okay, that's what we're talking about. Psychologically safe environment is a precondition for. Sorry, let me just go to the next one. It's not a nice to have. Is a precondition for high-performing organization. It's something that it has to be there for everything else to work. It's also a precondition for psychological well-being. Okay, there are many decades of studies around this notion of psychological well-being, especially done by this psychologist, Professor Seligman. And you can see here 5 ingredients that seems to be necessary, or the most important ones, for people to experience a good positive outlook of themselves and their lives. Okay, you can see things which are very interesting from a work perspective as well. Look at, for example, feeling supported with what I do, okay, inside of my working life, or feeling that I am engaged. In session number 2, we will be speaking a lot about this notion of mental flow. What is that and how it works? Okay, so these elements, which are essential for psychological well-being, which in its turn, it's critical for me to be mentally okay, they are all facilitated when my environment provides me with psychological safety. If you want to have a clearer idea of the importance of psychological safety, please think about during your childhood when you were trying to learn something in school and you felt that you were lagging a little bit behind and you didn't dare to say that to the teacher, or you were trying to solve a problem at home and you couldn't do that and your parents were getting upset with you because you couldn't solve the problem. The more they were getting upset with you, the more your brain was freezing, the more difficult it was becoming. So to provide a child or an adult with a psychologically safe environment, it's what is required for our brain to function at the best of its capacity. Now, if you truly want to look at that from a business organizational productivity perspective, one of the most interesting case studies, not the only one, but definitely the most popular one, is a study that was conducted by Google. And I know there are some people from Google here today with us, so thank you guys for doing this research. The Project Aristotle study, which, if I'm not mistaken, happened in 2012 for 3 years. Google wanted to study the most effective teams. Why were they performing so much better than any other team? And they studied 180 teams and 50,000 employees, so it's quite a relevant piece of work. And here's what's interesting. You can check this article on the New York Times. This is the most interesting one, but a few bullet points here. They discovered that no particular composition of the team in terms of skills, personality profiles, psychological profiles, so forth and so on, the composition of the team didn't really make a difference. The remuneration level didn't really make a difference. The fact that people in the team were having out-of-work relationships and they were friends outside of work didn't really make a difference. The biggest influencer of a team's performance, they found out it was if the members of that team were experiencing psychological safety. If they felt that they could share some of the leadership, if they felt that their contribution was valued, if they felt that they could speak up when needed without fearing any repercussion. Okay, so it's interesting to begin to realize that psychological safety is a prerequisite, on one hand, for psychological well-being and mental health, on the other, for performance. It's a little bit the glue that keeps these two worlds together. If I now may try to answer a question which could be there, which is, but why is that? Why is psychological safety so important? Allow me to take a couple of minutes to explain a few very quick and basic facts about how our brain works. The first one is to understand that my brain and your brain are incredible machineries which are designed with a specific purpose to defend ourselves and to defend itself as number one priority, which means that the moment in which your brain consciously or unconsciously detects a threat, which could be a disagreement, someone tried to overrule something that I said, any sort of threat, my brain goes into defense mode. And we will see in a moment that constitutes a specific way in which my brain operates. When I go into defense mode, main purpose of my brain and therefore my mind is to protect myself, not to think creatively. The second priority of the brain is to manage energy. Okay, so the moment in which your brain feels tired because you have a drop in glucose, the brain runs on glucose, you're gonna stop thinking properly. Your capacity to think rationally and logically is gonna decrease. That's why it's not good to work long hours and have long meetings one after the other. Ensure long-term survival, and eventually your brain has a purpose of making you happy if the other purposes have been accomplished. So that's why psychological safety is particularly important, because it's one of, if not the most primordial need that our brain is designed to satisfy. If we don't feel psychologically safe, there's a whole bunch of things that happen, none of which is particularly useful for long-term result, all of which are particularly useful for combat. Okay, so what you see here is a scheme, a representation of what happens when you and I feel under attack. Now, by under attack, I don't mean that we feel in a war zone. This could be in a meeting. This could be around the table at the Christmas dinner, or this could be anywhere in an interaction with another human being where somehow you feel, even without noticing it, that somehow someone is attacking you, or somehow your future is a little bit in jeopardy, or any situation in which you are experiencing an excessive amount of stress. So bottom line, to make the long story short here, you see all these neurochemicals that were mentioned here, dopamine, serotonin, adrenaline. These are all substances in your brain that regulates your mood. These are the different components of the fuel that your brain runs on. Okay, when you and I feel unsafe, there is a rush of adrenaline, cortisol, and a whole bunch of other stuff. Don't want to bore you with the details, but bottom line, it means that you have a peak of adrenaline and norepinephrine, which is noradrenaline. Same like if you were jumping from a bridge for bungee jumping, adrenaline goes up. Now, adrenaline makes your amygdala fire up, and it ignites the stress response, meaning you go on defense, you're ready to protect yourself, you're ready to attack the other. And here's what's, quote, the problem. There is an emotional response associated with that. So you feel angry, you feel anxiety, resentment, so forth and so on. And there is a behavioral response. Okay, it's all one after together actually. Meaning you're there to argument, you're there to misrepresent, you're there to avoid responsibility, to assign blame to others. Oftentimes, for example, people that are busy with creating a safety culture in their organization, they tell people, you should speak up. Well, that's a great idea, but unless you provide your people with a psychological safe environment, if they fear any repercussion to tell you the truth about anything, these are the behaviors that they will naturally adopt. You cannot ask people to speak up unless you provide them with the culture that allows for speaking up. Because otherwise what you're asking people to do is to sacrifice themselves. Okay, cognitive response, meaning how do you think when you're under threat? Well, there's a lot of mental rumination, justifying things to yourself, trying to find a way out, short-term defense kind of thinking, no strategic. Okay, so that's why psychological safety is crucial, because it's the requirement for this kind of thinking, okay, and this kind of things happening. So when you and I feel safe, well, there's a whole other bunch of neurochemicals that get released by our brain. Dopamine is the reward neurochemical. Serotonin is the happiness one, okay? Oxytocin is the social life neurochemical, is the one that you feel when someone that you love hugs you, or vice versa, okay? Orexin is very important for your sleep, okay? So when you and I feel that the environment around us allow us to be ourselves, there is no threat, then our brain is not busy with defending itself anymore. And what usually are called the superior cognitive and emotional functions, now they are at play. Now we're talking. Now we're talking to Homo sapiens sapiens. Before, yeah, we were talking to someone busy to defend oneself. Here we're talking with a proper, well-developed human brain, okay, that can do creative thinking, rational thinking, strategic thinking, that can speak up, that can provide constructive feedback to other people. So you can begin to see now, I hope, the link and the correlation between the state of our brain, our mental activity, and performance. Okay, We will go into flow, mental flow next time, but you can begin to see immediately how your emotional response drives a certain kind of thinking and vice versa, okay? They always work together, cognitive, emotional, and behavioral, which means the way I think, the way I feel, the way I behave, they're always three different expressions of one integrated system going on at the same time. So, one of the questions that oftentimes people ask me is, okay, so what are the skills or the factors that create a psychologically safe environment or a psychologically unsafe environment? Now, if we look at them here, this is nothing new, okay? This is something that most people are very familiar with in general in life. It's all common sense, but then we'll see why sometimes it's not so easy to do it. So on the green column, what you have is the enhancer of psychological safety. And especially these first 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are particularly important. They are the so-called emotional intelligence skills. Emotional intelligence is an idea that was brought to the public years ago by Daniel Goleman, who's an American psychologist. And they have to do with fundamentally the way in which I can manage my own internal life, mental and emotional life, and how I can regulate that to become an expression into the world, a set of behaviors which has an impact on other people. So for example, self-awareness. Self-awareness is the capacity to realize what's going on for me internally and to be able to see that I am feeling in a certain way, I am experiencing certain emotions, I am thinking in a certain way. My own thinking is the product of my own upbringing, my own point of view is not the truth. I am aware of that, and therefore I can modulate my response into the world in a way that creates a constructive interaction. And that's where you have self-regulation. Self-regulation is the capacity to mediate and moderate my inner world, my internal world, with the outside world. It's what differentiates us, for example, one of the many things that makes us different from animals, okay? Animals can very well mediate their internal volcanic emotions with their behaviors. We can do that. Sometimes I can be in a meeting and feeling a certain amount of anger, but I can self-regulate myself. I can control myself. Self-regulation and self-awareness, they go together. Okay, very difficult to self-regulate oneself if you don't have a certain amount of self-awareness. Empathy, it's an often very misunderstood word. We tend to think that empathy has to do with feeling, some sort of warmth and affection for one another. No, empathy is the capacity that I have to, in psychology, we call it to mentalize someone else, which means to be able to step into someone else's shoes and understand what goes on for them. Not necessarily agreeing, not necessarily feeling the same feelings, which by the way is impossible, but at least I can understand a bit their world, okay? Why they feel, why they think, why they act in a certain way. Critical skill. Motivation here, it has to do with internal motivation, not me motivating other people, but me being true to my own motivations. And social sensitivity has to do with being able to interact with people in a way that leaves them somehow okay with your own interaction style and content. Okay, your interaction doesn't hurt people, doesn't harm, doesn't create a negative impact in the world. And there are many others. Okay, now you can obviously see that the opposite is what creates a psychologically unsafe environment. One thing to say here is that we have to, when possible, try to understand that it's easier, the red column for us. That comes more natural, okay? And please don't take that as a moral judgment. It doesn't have to do with us being bad people, the fact that sometimes we have impulsiveness or egocentrism, or we tend to blame. It has to do with the cartoon that we saw at the beginning. We come from a history of having to fight for our survival. And it's only very recent, a few thousand years, that we got into an environment that we have created for ourselves, where when you wake up in the morning, you have quite a good probability to finish your day. Okay, that's a new experience for human beings. We spend tens of thousands of years where truly you didn't know if once the night arrived, if you would see the light of the day the next day, because predators, they oftentimes hunt at night. Okay, so our brains, they are structured with much more powerful emotional mechanisms, unconscious mechanisms, to drive us naturally towards being defensive. Sometimes best defense is attack, okay? So please keep this in mind. This doesn't mean that we're bad people, or your employees or whoever at home is someone bad or negative. It's a natural tendency of the species. It's a good tendency because it kept us alive for many decades of thousands of years, okay? And in today's world, we do have the chance of training ourselves and educate ourselves in these skills, which are much more sophisticated. They are all available, but they take a little bit of education and training, okay? You can see that in a child's development, okay? How much training it takes, how much education it takes for a child to step out of the normal egocentrism that we have when we are kids. You know, when you're a kid, you want to keep your toys all for yourself. You want to keep your mother's love all for yourself. It's a natural egocentrism. It takes a lot of interaction with other human beings, with the parents, to become someone that can be sensitive to others, that can empathize with others. Okay, these are all available skills, and they are skills, they can be learned, but it takes a certain amount of education. And in my own experience in the business environment, we're becoming more and more aware of that. Managers nowadays, they have a lot more training and education available in what sometimes they're referred to as soft skill, which I believe to be a horrible way of representing these fundamental human qualities and skills. But they are definitely required to create a psychologically safe environment. In terms of some ideas, for people, especially in this audience, which are leaders of teams, what are some characteristics or some actions that one can do as a leader in order to create a psychologically safe environment? They seem obvious, but again, to be cultivated. The first one is to be curious about the people that you manage. Sometimes we have a tendency, because we grow up in a performance-oriented environment, we might have every now and then the tendency to relate to people as means to a result. Okay, this is the team of people with which I have to produce this result. Nothing wrong there, but if you want to be a leader that creates a psychologically safe environment, to be interested and curious about what goes on with your people, that's critical. Ask questions and listen to the answers, even when you disagree. Oftentimes in our cultures, and I'm speaking about European, Western cultures especially, I don't want to offend anybody here, but we are trained, especially in school, in the art of arguing. Make a point, argue your way through a meeting. Okay, got it, great, done. Don't need any additional training in that. How about we learn a little better to listen? And in order for me to listen, I have to shut up. That's the basic about listening, okay? I can't listen to you while I'm talking to you. Okay? I have to shut up. I have to be quiet verbally, but as much as possible, I have to be quiet mentally. If in my own head I'm arguing how stupid it is what you're talking about, I'm not truly listening to you. I'm listening to my own voice in my own head. Okay, listening, very, very important. We'll speak about that more in future sessions. Express authentic appreciation for people and for their work. Critical word that is authentic. Okay, nobody likes phony people or fake appreciation, obviously, and it requires an effort to do authentic appreciation. The second last there for me is the most important, because at the end of the day, to do all of that, it takes time. And especially in the busyness environment, we are all very busy. Okay, and be very busy sometimes gives us the illusion that we don't have the time to dedicate to people. If you want to create a psychologically safe environment which is conducive to high performance, it takes time to be with people and to interact with them. There's no way around that. Okay. And last one is be transparent and clear when you communicate. Having hidden agenda. It's interesting to know that the human brain is designed to detect, to spot hidden agendas and lies and things that don't quite make sense. We have like a sixth or seventh or eighth sense for that kind of stuff. So people know if you as a leader, you're not telling them the truth, and the moment in which they feel that, even unconsciously, here we go back into the brain self-defense mechanism. So I've been speaking for 35 plus minutes, and I am very aware that I said a whole bunch of things in a very, very quick way. I hope that wasn't too quick. It probably was. But this is all that I wanted to present to you today in terms of content to cogitate around. And I think, Michael, now we have some time for people to ask questions.
Yeah, thanks, Lorenzo. So if you have questions, you can send them to me privately. You can put them in the group chat. If there's particular questions of interest to you, go right ahead and do that. There's a few that have come through, so we'll start with that. If you have more, just add it into the chat. So firstly, Lorenzo, isn't performance a matter of an individual's skills and talents more than the environment?
It's both. Okay, obviously, if you don't have the skills to play golf, even if you are inside of a fantastic environment, you're not going to be excellent at playing golf. So skills is definitely there, but your skills at some point are not going to be enough if the environment inside of which you operate tends to suppress your capacity to express these skills. Take any student which is brilliant and put that student into a classroom which is not conducive for learning and studying, and with teachers which are not very good at doing their job. At some point, the performance of that student is going to decline. So I would say can't do without skills, okay? But skills are going to be enhanced, and therefore performance is going to be enhanced or suppressed and reduced, definitely depending on the environment. One of the things that we saw earlier on is that our brain was on a slide. Our brain is a mechanism which is designed to receive and provide ongoing feedback with the environment. We tend to think that our mind is something which is closed in the skull, and that's it. No, your brain is a device which is designed to receive and provide feedback to the environment non-stop, even when you and I are sleeping. That's what I have on that one.
Great, thanks. And following on from that, what is a leader's role in shaping a psychologically safe environment?
One of the things that we're going to see in the second session is how people learn, adults, because we learn different from kids in different ways. And adults, they mainly learn by looking, observing, and participating into activities with other adults. So as a leader, I would say you set the tone, you set the standard, you set the example to speak in ordinary language. that everybody else is going to look at to understand what's expected of them in terms of behaviors. So to be a leader means that you are on the spotlight, meaning that people that are working with you and for you are going to consciously and unconsciously look at you to make up their minds about how to be in that organization. And they're going to look at what you do. They're not going to necessarily listen too much at what you say. So leader, that I would say that's the main role of a leader, is to, I know it sounds trivial, is to set the example, but if I can spend one more minute on this one, Michael, one of the
Yeah.
examples that I usually take, which tends to speak to people because we've all been there. If you have kids, or if you at some point in your life you were in a situation where dad was coming back home from work, okay? And I don't know if you've noticed, when dad comes back from work, kids react in a certain way. And sometimes you have a situation where kids are very happy because dad is coming back home from work. And sometimes you have kids that they go quiet when dad is coming back home from work because he's tired, because whatever. Which means that whenever daddy is coming into the household, the mood changes, the atmosphere changes. Now, same things with mommy, okay? But I'm a father, so I'm okay. And that's the role of a leader. The role of the leader is the one of somehow, with one's own behaviors, mindset, way of dealing with people, you set the mood, the atmosphere, or to speak in a little bit more sophisticated way, you shape the environment which allows for everything else to happen. Looks like a little bit of a vague idea, but that's the role of leaders. You set the environment, you set the tone.
Which says a lot for us as leaders in terms of how much we need to take on our own mental health and be on our own process to learn so that we can be there for our people. So there's another question that came through here, which is a bit further to one of the things that you said earlier. So as you were saying, the humans before were going to sleep without knowing if they would see the light of the next day. So this person is saying, well, that must have been so stressful. But then, right? But why then are mental health diseases more frequent over the last years, as per the study we showed earlier? And why is it increasing when actually we're so much safer than we were before?
That's a brilliant question, that one. So first of all, for the sake of scientific truth, we actually don't know if the caveman was more or less stressed than we are, because we didn't have a way to measure their stress back then, okay? But it's interesting that at least over the past 200 years, we have started to become quite good at measuring people's mental health in different environments, in different geographies, depending on income, depending on the work, et cetera, et cetera. So what was the second part of the question, Michael?
Why is it increasing when actually we're so much safer than before, those prior times?
Yeah, so because we are physically safer, the kind of stress that you and I are experiencing is not a stress that comes from the fact that a wolf or a lion is right there in front of us and we have to run away. But we are suffering from the kind of stress that comes from waking up every morning of your life inside of a performance-driven culture. And unless you live on a Pacific island, on a small tribe, or in some other environments, you are inside of that culture. Because once again, you and I are tested since day one of school, according to our performance, and that doesn't stop. So the number of times in which we can experience a potential failure or a potential sense of being inadequate to the request of society are exponentially much bigger than before. So that's one possible explanation of why these kind of disorders are increasing. For example, another one, just to give you an idea of how society shapes our mental health, over the past 20 years, there is a huge, unfortunately, a huge increase in terms of eating disorders, bulimia, anorexia amongst teenagers.
Mm.
Because nowadays, the pressure that it's on them because of social medias, the culture about looking in a certain way to be accepted, and the incredible increase of opportunities to be bullied and seen by others is making this kind of disorder spiking and raising into our society. Because once again, our brains and our minds are in constant communication with the environment for the good and for the best and for the worst.
Mm. Thank you. And so we'll see how time goes. Potentially the last question, if there's other questions, please do send them to me, is can you measure, you were just talking about measurement actually, but with the cave people, can you measure psychological well-being and psychological safety in the workplace so that as a leader, we have a better finger on the pulse of some of the things that you're speaking to here? Because we're wondering, how are my people doing in some of these areas? I would like to know, but I can't go out and talk to 20,000 people. So how do I measure to get a sense of some of these areas, that both the red zone and the positive zone of how my people are doing?
Uh, Can you measure psychological safety? Yes, you can. Can you measure psychological well-being? Yes, you can. More difficult. Psychological well-being is the experience that you have about your own internal world, and that can change from it's 10 to 5 in the afternoon here. You ask me a question about that, I give you an answer. You ask me the same question in half an hour, I might give you different answers. Then you can make an average over a certain amount of time, but it's not very indicative. So psychological well-being, so Daniel Kahneman, the late Daniel Kahneman, fantastic psychologist, Nobel Prize in economics that died just a few weeks ago. He did some great work about how do you measure people's, quote, happiness. The problem is that when you ask people questions about, are you happy? They tend to answer, am I happy right now? How do I feel right now? So that it's a bit tricky. But as organization, can you measure psychological safety? Yes, you can. Now, be mindful. Every time you want to measure something that has to do with human mental activities and or behaviors, you're going to come out with data that then needs interpretation. And that interpretation of the data is what is going to be useful. If you put yourself on a scale, you're going to get a piece of data that requires some interpretation. But if you are 65 kilos, you're 65 kilos. You're not 85, you're not 55. When it comes to measuring psychological safety, people's behaviors, mental health, level of engagements, level of fear towards their bosses, you can create all sorts of indicators. We do that in JMJ, but then what you have to be mindful about is that that data has to be transformed into a narrative which is useful, has to be interpreted. And that's where you can create, where you can have some very useful insights. And my recommendation would be don't improvise, because then you're gonna end up trying to measure something that you don't understand, or you don't know what to do with the data that you find yourself to have. Interpretation is the most important thing, and how to read the data is the most important thing when it comes to measuring psychological safety and anything that has to do with human behaviors. But it is possible, and it's done. It's been done.
Great. So then last question, what are some tips to reduce the daily amount of stress people have to deal with? The golden question, no pressure.
What are some tips to reduce stress? First of all is take a look at your work schedule and interject, is that English? I don't know. Inject regular breaks
Yeah.
throughout your day. Okay, take 1 hour, at least 1 hour for lunch. Don't have lunch at your desk. Okay, so do breaks. Your brain works very well for 30 to 45 minutes chunks. Then it goes boom. Okay, then it goes into I need to relax. That you want it or not, the brain is going to relax. Okay, so better create the right schedule for that. The second one, that's silly, but make sure you have very good sleeping habits. Sleeping is the most important part of the day for our brain. It's where it gets rid of toxic, dying neurocells, and it takes care of itself, the brain, during night. The other one, again, sounds trivial, but it truly works. Take frequent walks outdoor. Stay outdoor, walk outdoor. It's proven that frequent walks and sunlight exposition, to be exposed to sunlight and take walks, regular walks in nature. For people that, for example, suffer from depression disorders, that's as useful as antidepressant, sometimes even more. So regular breaks, good sleeping habits, uh, take walks outside, and the obvious, if you're a smoker and drink 15 coffees a day, nothing morally wrong with that, but okay, I would go
Might
easy.
add to it. All right, as they do in Hollywood, this is the lightning round. So you got 20 seconds to answer this last question that just came
Right.
in. How should we rebrand, quote, soft skills? What should we call it?
I would call them fundamental human skills. I don't know why
FHS.
they're soft compared to hard. I never understood that, but that's my own ignorance. But try to run anything. Try to run your family without these skills. Check what happens to your kids
Fundamental human
or your
skills. Thank
relationship. Right?
you. Yeah. All right, very good. So we're gonna wrap up and tell you a bit what's coming. So thanks for the participation. It's been a pleasure to have you with us. For those that asked questions, they were invaluable. So thank you for sending them over. As a reminder, and I think we have a slide for this, Lorenzo, in terms of the next session dates, where we'll continue and deepen in this is 12th of June, 9th of October. You'll get reminders and you'll get the links to join. What else? You're going to receive the slides from this with the recording from today and a list of books and articles that Lorenzo made reference to. If you have colleagues that would like to be included, you can send them the recording and they're welcome to join in the next sessions. So if you go to the next slide, Lorenzo, we have the email address. You can send to us if there's any questions, clarifications, anything we can help with around some of these topics. Feel free to be in touch. And again, thank you for being here. Lorenzo, thank you for walking us through that. And we very much look forward to seeing you in June. Take care,
Fantastic.
everyone.
Great pleasure to be with everybody. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.